John here from Ripewave Audio, and for today's video we're going to look at all the Audyssey options for room calibration when you use it with a Denon or Marantz AV receiver or processor. Mine happens to be a Marantz Cinema 50. This is part of the new line that they just released. And there are three options for doing your room calibration using Audyssey. Number one, you have the built-in on-screen display setup. And this doesn't cost you more. It comes with the unit. So you look at the models, the new ones at least, say that they're the MultEQ XT32 Audyssey. And it has a few other features like dynamic volume and everything with it. Then they have the MultEQ Editor app, which is $20, and it runs on an iPad or Android device, and you just download that from the Google Play Store or from the Apple the App Store, and you pay $20, and you can use that app for your receivers. And then finally, the newest addition is the MultEQ-X application, and this is a Windows-only application. It's not available for Apple at the moment, and sells for, I think it's $199, but let's just say $200. And this $200 fee is per user, per AVR. So you can't sell your AVR to somebody else and transfer this license. But you get free upgrades for life with it. So that's the good side and the bad side. What I'm particularly interested in, and this is what we're really going out to achieve here, is with Dirac coming to these Marantz AVRs and processors, I wanted to make sure that I was tuning using the Audyssey room calibration the best I could to get this Marantz sounding the best it could with Audyssey before comparing it with Dirac that's coming, I guess sometime at the end of March is what I've been told. And then it would be a fair competition. It'll also be a fair competition when I'm comparing the Marantz against other AV receivers and processors that we're bringing in. I really want to tune these things to their best of their abilities and then do the comparisons. And I think that's really where it gets fair. So we'll get into this. And so let's see how much can be done through the room calibration, how much that affects the sound quality. And in some cases, we'll see that they're going beyond room calibration. They're also getting into kind of tone controls at the same time. So let's look at these three things. Actually, before we do, I'm going to tell you about the setup that I typically do. Now, the basic Audyssey, and you'll see on the slide here, is 8 measurements, and they're fairly close together. Now, in the documentation for Audyssey, they say do not take these measurements more than 24 inches, 2 feet apart. I've heard some people who are pretty adept at this say they prefer to do around 20 inches. So I think that made sense to me. And if you measure out 20 inches, if you're on a couch or whatever, that's about as far as you're sitting, your heads are sitting from the person next to you. And I like to use multiple microphone stands. Now, if you only have one, that's great. If you don't have a microphone stand, it gets a little harder if you use that rocket ship, whatever, because, the couch and everything is not a firm place to set it on. You want to have something that sits firmly on the floor and that is stable and isn't going to rock back and forth and is going to hold up the Audyssey microphone straight up and down. In order to use these microphone stands, and it has a particular threading, it's a pretty big threading, you need a few things. You need an adapter that will take it down to the standard, kind of like a camera mount, which is like this. But you also most likely need a right angle. So here I've got this ball joint here that I use. And I have another adapter that I put on this that can hold this onto each one of these. And I have a couple of these set up. Actually, I have 3 that I can use. And what I like to do is set these up 1, 2, 3 along the seating area. and measure out 20 inches apart. Actually use a level, get them at the same heights, and make it as consistent as possible. And with 3 of these, when I do that next measurement that's 20 feet closer to the front of the room, 20 inches closer to the front of the room, all I have to do is slide these back and like this, 20 inches, and then take the next measurement, and then just move them out together again. And then for the back row, we'll do the similar thing. Actually, I leave these 2 in place, and the back of the couch actually holds a smaller stand, and I place that in between because the way those layouts are with the Marantz Audyssey, those 7 measurements, the ones in the back are in between the center and the right and left measurements. So I find that's helpful. I just thought I'd throw that in there. Let's talk about, we already talked about the cost. So the OSD on-screen display, built-in setup to your AVRs, Denon Marantz, is included. And you can run all this and get similar results. And if you want to have better control over it and run it from a tablet, tablet's better than a phone because the phone it's kind of small if you were going to do any curve adjustments on the screen. So tablet is much better, but a phone will still work, particularly if you're not going to do any curve adjustments. And that's $20. And then, of course, you've got your Windows app, which I have not got yet, but I've read through the manual. I understand the differences between all 3 of these, and I'm going to present these to you. What you will notice if you go on the Audyssey website now is they have a new calibrated microphone. Now, this is the microphone that came with the Cinema 50, this Audyssey microphone. This is calibrated at the factory, all of them with the same curve. So they're not individually calibrated. What Audyssey has available for $79 is the ACM-1X, which is individually calibrated. Very much how the UMIC-1 will work with, let's say, Room Equalization Wizard, REW. Or will work with the microphone that comes with the Emotiva. Those are individually calibrated. So we can load those calibration files directly in and have a match. So now Audyssey has one, but it's only available for use with the Windows MultEQ-X application. So unless you buy the $200 version, the $79 add-on microphone with its own unique calibration isn't going to do you any good. And furthermore, even the guy from Audyssey said there's marginal benefits with the calibrated microphone. So if you want that last ounce of satisfaction that you're being precise, then get the calibrated mic, and then you will have to upgrade to the MultEQ-X version. Number of positions. I said 8 positions when you'd use the built-in Cinema 50 on-screen display, but also with the MultEQ Editor. If you move up to the MultEQ-X, then you have up to 32 positions. Now, the interesting thing about this is the own documentation for MultEQ-X only shows up to 12 positions. So they have all the same positions as you would showing you in, let's say, a Denon Marantz manual for those first 8. But then they put in, as far as on the seated position on the couch, in between the 3 that are already there, an additional 2. And then they put an additional 2 behind you on the corners of the couch. And that's going to give you those extra positions that aren't there, but they're only going up to 12 positions. They're not making use of 32. So I think they're even saying that you want to do at least 8, but once you get into 10 or 12, it starts to get overkill for the way their algorithm works. And on this slide, you can see the difference between the layouts that you get with the built-in and the MultEQ Editor app versus those positions with the MultEQ X. With the MultEQ X, you can actually exclude or delete measurement positions. So let's take, say you took 10, 12, 14 or more measurement positions. You could decide later to exclude certain positions after the fact or delete them altogether, but it's only with that Windows app. Now, all of them let you go in and edit the speakers, the distance, the level, and the crossover. The MultEQ X app does one step further. It lets you disable a speaker calibration. So that speaker will still be enabled. Let's say you wanted to get rid of the side surrounds. Those side surrounds will still be active speakers in your system, but just not with the calibration filter applied. And you can decide which speakers to turn that on or off with. So that's an additional feature you get for your $200. Room correction results. If you're just running the on-screen display for your Marantz or your Denon, you're not going to be able to see what it did. It's just magic and okay, the curves are applied and now you can enjoy it. But when you go into the MultEQ Editor app, you can see side by side what is going on. So you can see the before and the after applied. When you go to the MultEQ X Editor, it takes you a step further there. So not only do you see the before and after, it actually shows you superimposed. So I think that's more useful there. And this is where you do go in and hit your delete and your disable if you want. And you can give these things a name and everything. So that's kind of nice. There's technologies built into your Denon Marantz receivers and processors called dynamic EQ, dynamic volume, and Audyssey LFC. So what are these? So dynamic EQ, what that's going to do is it's going to adjust the equalization curve depending on the volume of the material. This is similar to the loudness control that has been out there for decades, where it will boost things up, but it's kind of a static boost. So you just have to realize at some point when you raise the volume, you don't want to have that loudness button pushed any longer, and you take it off. But this is just gradually backing off the loudness curve when you raise the volume. So that is kind of neat there. And then they have dynamic volume control. So for variations between loud and soft passages, so you can either apply this in a light fashion, a medium fashion, or a heavy fashion. So each of these programs lets you do that in those degrees. And one thing I noticed that for the documentation for the MultEQ-X, they're not labeled light, medium, heavy, but rather day, evening, and midnight. But I think they're essentially the same application, just with different names, basically small, medium, and large. Then there's the Audyssey LFC, low frequency containment. And the whole idea, this is for apartment type use where you have houses close by and you don't want the subwoofers rattling the walls and everything. And you can contain this on a scale from 0 to 7, 0 being off. 1 through 7 is actually while it's on. And this will just essentially try to leave some of the excitement in the bass, but not rattle the house. And that's what that's doing. Now, all of these have it. The interesting thing is when you're in the MultEQ-X environment, you can actually set those parameters. You know, is how much am I applying dynamic EQ? Is it going to be, is there going to be a reference offset of 0, 5, 10, 15 decibels? For dynamic volume, is that going to be light, medium, heavy, or day, evening, midnight? And then for the low frequency containment, is that being applied and is that level 1 through 7? With the mobile app, you just essentially turn those on and they get applied with the defaults, but you don't get the chance to set those levels unless you go into now your receiver or processor and modify them. So obviously, if you're on the receiver, you can go in and turn those on. Let's look at the next set of features in these. So you have filter presets. So when you load a filter with Audyssey, it actually comes with multiple curves. So there is a flat curve and a reference curve. And the reference curve is designed how movies are normally mixed. But not all movies are mixed this way. So that's the reference curve, and that's where they try to start you at, and that's their default. But if you don't want that movie reference curve applied, you can just go to flat, and a lot of people recommend starting with flat, but we should try both ways to see what you prefer, right? Then they have this other feature where you can actually bypass the room calibration entirely for your front, left, and right speakers. But room calibration would then apply to all the other speakers. And this is with the filters as loaded into your receiver. And you can just toggle between these. So you can try them out as you go. What happens with the on-screen display one is that just loads directly. You're in the receiver, you're in the processor. With the MultEQ Editor or the MultEQ-X application, you get everything set up in those applications, and then you send it to the receiver. When it sends it to the receiver, it's sending it with both of those profiles. So it can toggle between the two. And you're basically setting the default states, the initial states of those when it loads in. The next thing that you have is within the editors themselves, some of them have the ability to, you'll have the ability to adjust which frequency ranges will be applied. Now, the on-screen display built-in version, you don't have the ability. It's just going to do the full range. When you're using the MultEQ Editor app, you'll be able to slide down a curtain and just say, no, I'm not going to calibrate anything over 500 hertz. And then basically focus on the low frequencies. And some people like to put that at the Schroeder frequency. What I understand of that is this is the point where the room has less influence on the sound, and it's more the speaker having influence on the sound in the room. So if your whole idea is to cancel out the effects of the room, then you may just get away with 200 to 500 hertz range in there to set is the maximum high frequency that you're going to apply room calibration to. Now, with the Windows MultEQ-X, you can also cut out a low frequency application. So maybe you want to start that at 20 hertz, for example, and then focus your calibration between 20 and 200 hertz. So it gives you more flexibility when you go to the MultEQ-X application. Then you have high frequency roll-off options. Now with the MultEQ Editor app, they give you a couple of presets. And it depends on how large a room you have. For most rooms, preset 1 is going to be fine. If you have a really large room, I think they want you to go then to preset 2. But when you go to the MultEQ-X editor, you don't have those presets, or at least I couldn't find that. But you still have the ability to modify the target curve, so you can achieve essentially the same thing. You just don't have the preset, at least I don't think you do. And I also note that the built-in on-screen display, you don't have any way to modify the high-frequency roll-off. Now, mid-range compensation. What Audyssey has been doing is at 2 kilohertz, they take a 1 dB dip. I think it's a decibel. And this, they feel, is the normal point where the crossover between the drivers is happening. And they say a lot of speaker manufacturers actually do a boost there. and they're trying to compensate from that. Now, at this point, I don't think this is room calibration. This is trying to adjust for the speaker itself. And a lot of people say if you have good speakers, just don't bother with mid-range compensation. The problem is with the on-screen built-in version, it's always on. You don't have a way to turn it off. If you pay $20 for the app, then you have the way to turn that off by your speaker pairs. With the MultEQ X application, you can turn those on and off individually for each, the left speaker, the right speaker, not just pairs. Then there's then there is the target curve editor, which isn't built into the Marantz or the Denon receivers, but if you have, again, the app, you can use a basic adjustment and by pairs change the target curve. And this is where the tablet really helps, because using your finger to adjust that curve on a phone can be nearly impossible. And with the MultEQ X, you can do this in a more advanced way to individual speakers. Furthermore, with the MultEQ X, you have a bunch of bi-quad features, including parametric EQ, which is what a lot of people prefer to do to use their boost and their cuts. So that's very good. A few more unique features that only MultEQ X has. One is the subwoofer level matching tool. Now, the other methods also do level setting for your subwoofers, but the MultEQ X gives you more control over that process. Now, the other thing that the MultEQ X is going to let you do is import from REW, Room Equalization Wizard. So if you're a power user and you've got some things you want to bring in from REW, you can do that. The last thing I'll mention is the ability to save and load results. And you can do this with both the Editor app and EQ-X. And you can save and load copies there. So I went through and did all of my calibration once with just the Cinema 50 on-screen display, and was a little disappointed in the bass and how that really sounded. And I think overall it seemed a little thin to me. And I went back just recently and ran through it with the $20 app on the iPad. The iPad's also great because you can now stand away from the business, right? You're not going to be in the room right next to it. It's all wireless, and that's really nice. And I say the results improved. So what I did is I left preset 1 for my speakers as the original in Marantz setting that we did with Audyssey in Marantz. The preset 2 being the one I did with the editor application. In each case, I did turn off dynamic EQ, dynamic volume, although the first one did have the low frequency containment on because I didn't have a choice. But I did turn that off when I was using the editor app. So I wanted to make this less about tone control and volume adjustments and just what it's doing for calibration on the room measurements that it's taking. And I did feel that the one that I did with the MultEQ Editor did sound better. But I did feel it was still lacking in how it is treating the sound. I did think the bass still needed to be bumped up. So I went back another time and I adjusted the curves and boosted the bass up, and it sounded better. But it didn't sound as good as I know these speakers and these amplifiers can do, because that's what I'm keeping consistent in my room is the speakers and the amplifiers. So we make it all about the processing capabilities and how these room calibrations and settings are made to do my comparisons. So right now my Emotiva is the reference, and I know some of you say it's unfair comparison against something a little more expensive, but at least tells me that I can do better, that there's not a fault necessarily with my speakers, or I can enjoy the system more without replacing my speakers, put it that way. So it did get better, but I still feel like it could do more. But maybe that's not the room calibration. It could very well be just the inherent circuitry within this Marantz receiver that I have, the DACs that it's using, and that could be influencing the sound. So the calibration may be doing a real excellent job. In fact, the curves that it's showing looks like it's leveling things off pretty nicely. But I think that's the lesson here, is that the calibration is going to take it to a certain level. It can't overcome necessarily the sound characteristics of the processor itself. So you can do a little bit. You can apply some of these different things. You can turn certain features on and off, like the Audyssey LFC, low frequency containment, dynamic volume, dynamic EQ. You can play around with those, adjust the curves. And if you got the advanced version, you got that parametric EQ that you can do, and the subwoofer matching tool, and have a little more control over this. But I think at some point, the Marantz and Denon processors may only take you so far. But then again, I don't have the most expensive Denon Marantz products here. Perhaps they will do better with more advanced circuitry. And as I get more skilled at doing Audyssey, maybe I can get a little bit better there too. But I will say that running Dirac on the Emotiva, right off the bat, had much more pleasing results. So I tend to say that has more to do with the internal circuitry than maybe the calibration, or maybe a little bit of both. And one more thing, if I had to choose between these three applications, the on-screen display version, the editor application, or the MultEQ-X Windows app, I think really the $20 app option is the sweet spot. The on-screen one is just lacking some of that control that I think is also important, like getting rid of that compensation there, and that dip at 2 kilohertz. I want to be able to control that and determine if I like that or not. Be able to slide that curtain down and say, I'm only going to process up to maybe 500 hertz. That is a very useful feature. Now, while the Windows application, the X, the MultEQ application, has a lot more features, I'm not sure they buy you that much unless you are a real enthusiast that want to get in to do a lot of the tweaking. But I think for the average user, the mobile app is probably the best way to go. And for $20, it's not a harsh investment. Paying the $200 more is quite a consideration, in the fact that Denon Marantz for these new models are also going to charge for the Dirac. Again, becomes a question of am I going to get a better experience out of Dirac than with the MultEQ application? If Dirac is the way to go, although they're not putting in the multi-bass and all of these new features that are in Dirac, even at that, am I better to put my money in the Dirac or the MultEQ application? So that is something to consider. So what are your thoughts on this? I hope that this breakdown of the three different tools has helped you. How far do you think you can take your system just by going through these room calibrations? Do you feel like you can compensate for other things that is in the system? Do you think that overcoming levels of performance with your DACs that are built into your AVRs and your processors is something that's a bridge too far for these tools, that feedback would be useful for the Ripewave audio community. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to take your support of this channel to the next level, you can go to www.patreon.com/Ripewave and consider subscribing there. And of course, you can do a one-time thanks for us, and that's always appreciated. But always hit that bell icon so you will be notified when the next video is published. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.